Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about the question, outline the mechanisms by which the kidneys maintain potassium homeostasis. So potassium is the main intracellular ion and it's important for membrane potential in all cells, especially excitable tissues. Normal plasma concentrations are about 3.5 to 5.2 millimole per litre and it's mostly intracellular, so it's about 150 millimole per litre intracellularly. Your daily potassium load from diet is about 100 millimole per day. And to maintain homeostasis, whatever is put into the body needs to also leave the body. So you need to eliminate about 100 millimole potassium per day to maintain this homeostasis. You eliminate about 90 millimole per urine and 10 millimole per feces. Already we can see here that if majority of it is eliminated through urine, then our kidneys must play a major role in handling potassium. So renal potassium handling comes down to three processes. So renal excretion is equal to filtration, which is the plasma potassium that is freely filtered at the glomerulus, minus reabsorption, which is a fixed proportion of filtered potassium that's resorbed by tubules, which we don't have a lot of control over, plus secretion, which is variable and there's different steps in the way we regulate this. This equation describes renal excretion, and I'll go through each of these three processes to explain their role in the management of potassium handling. So potassium is freely filtered through the glomerulus into filtrate, and we can actually calculate around how much potassium is filtered per day. So we know that we have a glomerular filtration rate of about 180 litres per day, and we know that the potassium concentration of plasma is about 4 millimole per litre. So if we multiply this by 180, because there's 180 litres per day that's filtered, your total potassium that's filtered would be about 720 millimole per day. Now, although we don't have much control over how much potassium is actually filtered, the GFR is controlled, and that's through tubular glomerular feedback and myogenic mechanisms, which I explain further in some of my other videos on my channel. For resorption, this is largely fixed, with about 65% of filtered potassium being reabsorbed in the proximal tubules, and this is largely through passive paracellular diffusion and solute drag with water, and via luminal potassium channels as well that facilitate this. Then about 25 to 30% is through the loop of Henle, especially the thick ascending limb, and this is through passive paracellular diffusion again, as well as active through sodium potassium 2-chloride cotransporters, which are also a target for diuretics such as furosemide. So furosemide targets this particular cotransporter, hence why when you give furosemide, people will lose sodium, potassium and chloride in their urine, and it ruins the countercurrent multiplier mechanism for medullary concentration, which is why people then cannot concentrate their urine through the collecting ducts because there's no concentration gradient for water to follow, hence why it's such a good diuretic. Then in the late distal convoluted tubules and convoluted collecting ducts, there are type A intercalated cells, and during times of low plasma potassium concentration, the luminal hydrogen potassium ATPase will be more active, pumping hydrogen out into the urine or into the filtrate in return for potassium. So essentially, when there is hypokalemia, so low potassium in the plasma, you can reabsorb about 99% of filtered potassium through the kidneys. And finally, secretion of potassium, which we do have some control over, is mainly regulated through principal cells of the late distal tubules and cortical collecting ducts. And this is under the influence of a couple different factors and a hormone. So if we have our principal cell and we have our sodium potassium ATPase, which moves sodium out of the cell into the interstitial fluid and potassium from the interstitial fluid into the cell, you then have these potassium channels as well on the tubular side or the lumen side, which allow potassium to diffuse out of the cell into the lumen and then be excreted in urine or secreted into the urine, while sodium can follow its concentration gradient back the other way and be absorbed into the cell. So this sets up the basic premise of how this system works. Now, the different influences of this system is firstly potassium concentration of the extracellular fluid itself. So as you have increased potassium concentration, you get increased potassium secretion. And this is due to potassium itself stimulating these basolateral sodium-potassium ATPase pumps, which means that there's more potassium that is exchanged for sodium into the cell, and then it will then follow its concentration gradient from the cell into the lumen. This is facilitated by ROMK channels. So these are renal outer medullary potassium channels that sit on the luminal side, and they're largely under the influence of aldosterone, which is our next mechanism or our next influence for potassium secretion. So increased aldosterone leads to increased potassium secretion. So aldosterone again stimulates these basolateral sodium-potassium ATPase channels, which then leads to again more sodium out of the cell and more potassium into the principal cells. They will then move through their concentration gradient into the urine, and this is facilitated by these ROMK channels. Now, as potassium is moving into the tubular fluid, obviously the potassium concentration will increase unless that tubular fluid is being washed away. So our next mechanism is distal tubular flow rate. So increased distal tubular flow rate from increased volume, increased filtered sodium, diuretics, etc., will lead to increased potassium secretion. And this is because as the flow rate increases, the potassium that is excreted is washed away, meaning that your concentration gradient between inside the principal cells to the filtrate and the urine is greater, which will facilitate potassium excretion. This mechanism is also important for balancing the effects of aldosterone on sodium and potassium regulation. So in the example where you have high sodium intake and you have decreased renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system activation with decreased aldosterone, you would have decreased potassium excretion, which means that potassium might build up in the blood. But because you've got high sodium intake, you'll also have increased filtered load within the filtrate, which means you have increased tubular flow rate because of the increased volume and water that's sitting there, which will then facilitate potassium excretion, which will help maintain this homeostasis so that you don't accumulate too much potassium in the blood when aldosterone is not being activated. Lastly, acidosis will also affect potassium secretion within principal cells, but it actually decreases potassium secretion. And this is because acidosis leads to decreased activity of sodium-potassium ATPase, which leads to decreased potassium uptake into principal cells. So you have less concentration gradient between the principal cells and the filtrate and urine, so you have decreased potassium secretion. It's worth noting though that in chronic acidosis, you'll have potassium exchanging with hydrogen within the body, so you have higher potassium concentrations within the extracellular fluid. And because potassium is freely excreted through the filtrate and only a certain amount is resorbed and you can meet that threshold quite easily, there will always be some potassium loss in the urine. So for example, someone with diabetic ketoacidosis who's been acidic for quite some time, they may come in and have high potassium in their blood. But as you correct the acidosis and hydrogen ions move out of the cells and are excreted and the sodium ATPase starts to function, extracellular potassium will be pulled back into cells and their total body potassium is actually quite low, and you'll need to replace this as part of their management. So to summarize, renal potassium excretion is the sum of filtration minus reabsorption plus secretion. And secretion is where we have more control. Our kidneys are able to control this more, as filtration is fixed and reabsorption is largely fixed.